Hello, and welcome back to Varn Vlog. And today I'm going to be tackling the biological elements of Freddie deBoer's argument, which are the most controversial because he'll be accused of sounding like Charles Murray in the bell curve. deBoer doesn't pull that much from Murray. He pulls mostly from Eric Turkheimer's 3 laws of behavioral genetics. And even this is going to have some controversy. The issue here is not just over the racial differences being somehow genetically determined, even though race itself is not a genetic category. As I've said before, the morphology of human beings is more variant even within people who share relative DNA holotypes comparatively to people who don't. So there are a remarkable range of genetic diversity of quote sub-Saharan unquote Africans, which that means Africans without a lot of intermarriage with European and West Asian populations, and the entire rest of the human genome. And that means, for example, there are some groups of Africans who are more genetically distinct from each other than they are from Europeans or Asians. And Europeans and Asians also, although morphologically quite different, share a whole lot of DNA. This makes total sense if you understand how genetic drift works and genetic complexity, as well as the fact that there would always be more genetic complexity in the older population families, of which Africa would be. Now, what does it have to do with education? That's a whole different matter. And I want to talk about heritability, genetics, and biological determinism, and the critiques of Turkheimer's arguments that may or may not apply to deBoer. I will say Freddie doesn't actually do that much with the genetic arguments. He uses it as one of his many arguments, arguing that schools by themselves aren't going to change a whole lot in educational outcomes because the difference. And I think that that's more or less true. Even if the differences are sociological, are about environmental factors, of which the classroom is only one of the environments with a limited set of environmental factors compared to other things that determine nutrition, social access, cultural capital, etc., then there's a whole lot of problems with heritability that are beyond genetics. And aren't going to be fixed by just trying to school harder, and never have been fixed by that. But I do want people to understand the arguments here and why Freddie it might be seen as being somewhat controversial, because he sounds like a biological determinist as opposed to somebody of whom heritability is one of many factors. And yet I also said that it's not his primary argument. So some of these things go back to the debates around genetic behavior, all the way back to debates between like Richard Dawkins and Richard Lewontin, who point out that there's several conceptual and category errors using social data to make social policy about individuals. First is there's a fallacy of heritability being immutable. And we're going to talk about this in certain traits that are not just related to intelligence, although intelligence is going to be particularly problematic here because it has such a fucking loosey-goosey definition. The most common critique of people like Turkheimer and thus Freddie deBoer is that a heritability score, particularly if it's like 0.5 or 0.8, is a measure of how much a trait is fixed or unchangeable between generations. The problem is that heritability is a population statistic, not an individual statistic. It measures how much variation in a group at a specific time in specific environments that are relatively stable can be attributed to a possible genetic difference. And notice I said possible, because factoring out all the factors makes it very hard to tell the genetic difference if you do not find a gene marker specifically for that trait. And we'll get into how complicated this can be in a minute, but anyone who's studied anthropology should know this, or studied biological anthropology, not cultural anthropology. They do something completely different. And while I'm interested in that, it's actually less my specialty. Height, for example, is highly heritable. It's about 0.8 or 80%. Yet the average height increase is several inches in the 20th century, almost entirely due to nutrition. The height increases outstrip, as we've seen in places like Korea, what could possibly be explained by genetic difference. A trait could be 100% heritable and still be 100% changeable through environmental intervention, because you don't know what the difference ratios could be with an environmental change. Just because a gap is possibly genetic does not mean that it would exist in the same way if you're in a different environment with different, let's say, more supportive or even less supportive inputs. Height is a big one. Skin tone is a big one. Skin tone changes in populations faster than genetic drift can explain. This is not even getting into epigenetics, genetic noise. It is getting into environmental triggers. But for example, a baseline height being highly heritable and yet also changing dramatically if there's a massive change in, say, a cultural diet, proves that even though we know height is hereditary, tall people have taller kids for the most part, it's not 100% hereditary, and other inputs can change it. So the genes respond to environmental stimulus. And that's when we know there's a gene marker. All right. Now, Turkheimer and deBoer rely heavily on twin studies, which compare identical versus fraternal twins and their outcomes. However, the modern genome-wide association studies, the GWAS, often fails to find specific genes that account for high heritability numbers suggested by the twin studies. We cannot find a lot of these genes, particularly in relationship to intelligence. Since we cannot point to an intelligence gene, kind of like we couldn't point to a gay gene back 10 years ago, and that's now been confirmed, we found thousands of tiny genetic variants that each explain a fraction of the percentage of the variants found in heritability. Meaning there's no singular gene being passed down, and we also don't know how these gene variants, since there are so many of them interacting to create intelligence, also interact with environmental stimuli and cues. So, academic aptitude is not a singular gene of which you get a biological answer for it, even when you're just limiting it to abstract intelligence. But it's a massive complex traits that include personality traits, health, sensory processing, that interact with environmental factors like socioeconomic status, in ways that we don't understand, and which also interact with neuroplasticity, meaning your brain does change over time. Now, this still does not mean schooling is going to be the answer to the problem. So Freddie is probably still mostly correct. But it's something that I want you to think about when people make genetic claims. There is obviously and undeniably genetic components to intelligence, as there is to all human difference. But we don't really know what they are, since there's no singular gene marker for a thing called intelligence. Intelligence is a complex set of traits, mostly defined, and when we're talking about IQ in terms of abstract reasoning, but there are other forms of intelligence: long memory, memory cycles, responsiveness to processing, uh, all kinds of things that don't show up on an IQ test. Gene environment correlation makes this even more complicated. And again, this is without even getting into more new elements of understanding genetics like epigenetics. Turkheimer's laws of behavioral analysis acknowledge that genes and environments are usually correlated. But critics argue that people like Turkheimer and deBoer downplay how much genetic scores actually captures environmental advantages. So genes may actually just be playing into sociological and environmental advantages. Let me give you an example. If a child has a slight predisposition towards being calm, they have higher dopamine receptivity, which is something you can genetically inherit. Teachers may, and do, this has been well studied, treat them better, give them more resources, and eventually they score higher on tests. This actually is often used to explain the gender difference in outcomes in schooling, which I'm not even going to get to today, but gender has become a major predictor of schooling influences. And by the way, it's one of the few times where being a boy is actually to your disadvantage. Until you get very, very high up in the educational echelons, in which case being a boy is having an effect, although less and less of one than it did historically. Genetic scores actually may be measuring compounding interest in environmental privilege based off of small genetic traits, which may not even be directly related to abstract intelligence. If you change the environment, train teachers to be more patient with visited kids, the heritability gap may actually change, but we don't know how much because we have too many different traits of which we are measuring, which make up intelligence, which again is an abstract concept that exists because we've named it as such, but does not have a singular genetic component that we have ever been able to find in a key way. Now, when we talk about like the bell curve, even more than Turkheimer and Charles Murray, most of Charles Murray's book actually isn't about the racial stuff. It's basically arguing that you can't do a whole lot about this. The problem with that is we didn't have the human genome completely mapped when that book was written. Today, we know a lot more. Now, I'm going to talk about interactionism. A major critique of Turkheimer's laws of behavioral genetics assumes that environment and genes are additive, that gene plus environment equals outcome. But more recent biological studies, including ones that include epigenetic studies, say they are interactive. A specific talent gene may only express itself in a high resource environment. So if you're in a low resource environment, you may never actually have the opportunity or even the resources in terms of nutrients to trigger the gene expression. In a low resource environment, other factors, including epigenetic ones, which means things that are inherited from your parents that are from conditions that happen to them. It sounds almost Lamarckian. It doesn't fundamentally change your DNA, but it does affect gene expression, in which case certain genes might be rendered silent or even detrimental when they would be advantageous in other environments. Meaning that we cannot say what is going to be, completely variable, even if we know that certain traits are highly heritable. This is the problem with static biological determinism. Now, the reason I still agree with Freddie, and I'm going to get to this when we get to the Flynn effect, which is the most damning thing, is that while intelligence and academic aptitude are social constructions, they're things that we have created by the language to speak about them. Think about Ian Hacking's types of people. if we think about when we create a category, that category has a set of limiting definitions that have corresponding traits. Those traits are probably natural and inherent, but clustering them together is not. All right. So academic aptitude is not a clean category like, say, blood type or height or eye color, but it's a social construct that deals with very specific types of industrialized labor and abstract reasoning. If you naturalize the status quo by assuming that since some of the elements that we refer to as intelligence are somewhat static because they're heritable and don't deal with the elements that are not, you can assume that these measures of things like static scores are always valid, even though we're not necessarily proving that they are. If our society values different skills, the heritability of success would involve an entirely different set of genes. Think about it. If you need agricultural dexterity or emotional labor, which we need a lot of these days, and in fact, that's one of the few industries that are dependent on that are actually existing, probably because the predominance actually existing in force, probably because the predominance of the needs of healthcare is relatively static, particularly when you have an aging population. So success involves a set of traits that some of which are probably undeniably genetic, but we cluster them together by social constructs. This is scientific. It's not postmodernism. Don't get off your hat unless you believe in Platonic categories, which is not a scientific concept in the first fucking place. Lastly, this brings me to the Flynn effect. It is well documented that during most of the 20th century, every decade, IQ tended to go up 3 to 5 points when tested. Genetic evolution happens over millennia, not decades. If an IQ can jump 30 points in a century, which it did due to better schooling, nutrition, education, technological innovation, social discipline, etc., then the genetic floor that deBoer worries about is clearly more like a moving platform that we are pushing up. And that goes back to what I said earlier. Even if the trait is heritable, you can change it with environmental inputs. Which, by the way, is why I am still a socialist. Now, I want to talk about the Flynn effect because it's ended in the industrialized world. But you cannot talk about heritability being totally determined and ignore the fact that these traits change over time in ways that cannot be explained by natural or sexual selection. Now, this is the most technical of my videos that I've given in a long time. But there's a reason why I'm going through this in this technical way, because I do believe there are genetic elements to the cluster of traits we call intelligence. I do not believe they are static. I do not believe that they are clear, and these are population markers. We've seen that even sometimes moving people's environment can change their IQ scores even before nutrition does. But nutrition has a massive effect, just like it does on height. And we don't know what environmental triggers suppress an otherwise beneficial gene. This really matters for education. Now, here's where I'm going to disagree with Freddie a little bit. Freddie says that there is no educational crisis. I say there is no schooling crisis. Freddie points out that the OECD is similar declines even in better school systems, and I agree with that. But I want to talk about the Flynn effect, or what is developed now, which is what we call the reverse Flynn effect, which has happened in the 20th century. For almost all the 20th century, Western and industrialized countries in which we studied this, Scandinavia, the UK, France, Germany, and especially the US and Canada, IQ scores have begun to plateau or drop in the late 20th and early 21st century. Going back and looking at the Flynn effect and adjusting for the presence of TV and computing, it does seem like the moment mass internet became available, we actually saw plateaus in IQ scores, which is the opposite of what you would think with abundant free information. Now, IQ is supposedly not dependent on information, although it kind of is, because you have to understand the language in which the test is given. And if you don't, there are limits to it, although there are designs in the test to try to mitigate that by focusing on pictorial and other forms of abstract reasoning. I'm not going to get into all the complicatedness of the IQ test, but in short, because the test is in a language and you have to pick a language standard form, there are cultural biases in the test, which lead to this racial biases that you often hear liberals talk about. The issue is those racial biases are worse in other things like grades. They're actually more extreme in grades. So, yeah. Recent studies from Northwestern University, particularly in 2023 and 24, and longitudinal data from Comscript military tests in Europe confirm a broad spectrum downward trend in IQ scores. The reasons for the reversal are complicated, but I'm going to give you the four major theses, and I'm going to suggest that all of them play a role, and you will hear me point out none of them are genetic, meaning that this decline in the advantages made by the Flynn effect is happening too fast to be explained by just dysgenic breeding or any other thing you might hear some racialist wackadoos try to talk about. One reason for the reversal might be what we call the ceiling effect, which is we have simply maxed out on the environmental gains available to education. Once the population has abundant nutrition, universal schooling, low exposure to lead and mercury, there are fewer easy wins left to boost scores, so scores decline relative to those successes. Now, I think the drop, which has not been profound, but has been statistically significant, is still enough to say that it's probably a little more than the ceiling effect, but that clearly takes the role. Another thing is that modern curricular focus tends to focus more on rote memorization or test-taking skills rather than deep abstract reasoning that older IQ tests were designed to measure. I think this is copium. If you look at mid-20th century education, it was also pretty much based on memorization. In fact, in literature, I teach much less memorization today than we historically did in the 1980s and 90s. Furthermore, there's some evidence that memorization actually creates a bank of stuff in your brain that helps you have quick references to check other things that you should know, meaning that it actually isn't that much of an effect on things like IQ. Now, it's true that I don't think we get to many of the deep abstract reasoning things anymore because we've never gotten to them for the majority of students, like Freddie deBoer points out. We just push them more and more into the standards, push them younger and younger into the standards. People superficially meet them by whatever means necessary, from having their parents do their homework to using AI to do it, and we pass it off. Then we see drops later on when those resources from parents and whatnot aren't there. I've studied this for 2 decades and seen it in real time. We've seen writing ability decline between 6th and 12th grade in certain students and student populations. Do we know that they ever had the writing ability? No, because they weren't based on timed in-person tests. They were based on writing samples. So when you see timed in-person tests, sometimes you just see a lot less success, even with people who are doing their own writing and not cheating, because they have less reflection time. There's a large debate, though, about digital brain rot. The high-speed social media and constant outsourcing of memory to smartphones and to Google, you can even look up the Google effect, are changing our cognitive muscles. And this has been even more doubled down on with AI and perceived cognitive declines around AI in a very rapid period of time. Like we're talking 2 or 3 years, buddies. That's actually unheard of in terms of population level changes, yet we're seeing it. So we may be getting better at spatial abilities, so it's navigating 3D worlds and skimming, while getting worse at verbal reasoning, vocabulary, and more complex math. Then, lastly, and this is another interesting one, is researchers have been looking at modern pollutants that weren't prevalent in the mid 20th century, such as microplastics and endocrine disruptors, as potential contributors to cognitive stagnation. But we just don't have enough data to draw strong conclusions on that. And would they be worse for you than lead? Um, Now, what is interesting though is the Flynn effect is still in full swing in a lot of BRICS countries, much of Africa and Southeast Asia. One is nutrition is continuing to improve in regions where caloric intake and micronutrients such as iodine and iron are still improving in availability. The biological floor for brain development and cognitive gains is probably still rising. We also see a massive move from 50% literacy rate to 90% literacy rate, which makes a population much more easy to test in terms of abstract reasoning scores. If people can't read, it's hard to tell how good they can abstractly reason. Another issue with the heritability and genetics test is literacy tends to be highly heritable, even though no one believes that it is based primarily on genetics. Furthermore, moving from rural traditional lifestyles to complex technologically dense urban environments forces cognitive upgrades, which changes the way people process abstract symbols and logic. There is a small truth to the idea that peasant life um, is a sack of potatoes. Now, there are also skills, however, that we're realizing that we lose when you move into these dense urban environments that are technologically rich, and other forms of reasoning that we've seen decline. But they're not generally caught in IQ, another issue about IQ. So, what does this matter to the Freddie deBoer debates? Well, from the hereditarian view, the reversal of the West proves that once you clean up the environment, you will hit hard genetic limits. So that's probably what Freddie would argue, and that's definitely what Turkheimer would argue, and Charles Murray would argue. I actually probably should just ask Freddie what he would argue about this. He's not as big on talking about the genetic components of his first book these days. Probably because he's not super, he's not a geneticist. He's not super duper certain about this. I'm not a geneticist either. I'm recounting stuff I've read and reading modern literature about this. The environmentalist view is that there isn't a genetic wall, but a sign that our current environment has become toxic in new ways. If we change the environment again, we would see scores rise again. However, neither one of these interpretations are things you can fix just within the context of schooling. And again, we've seen this in kind of severe ways. Now, some people will try to say in the United States, the decline in verbal math skills and the rise in spatial skills is actually still based on genetics and even racial, because of the variance in birth rates amongst demographic groups. But that doesn't explain certain other places like the UK, including parts in Scandinavia, where you see this even in demographic groups amongst themselves. So you can't say it's an influx of African immigrants causing the reversal of the Flynn effect when you also see it and relatively, again, homogenous with the asterisk that you need to have for the asterisk. See the other video where I talked about that. Populations exist. Now in Southeast Asia and in Central Africa, we still see an increase in IQ, and the Flynn effect is still going in that way. And in China and India, we don't just see it, but we see it going faster than it did in the industrialized West. The reasons for this are complicated again, but massive urbanization and high sex academic culture and high levels of competition amongst people for jobs and other advantages seem to indicate that this outstrips any breeding that would go into raising IQ. It's much faster of a phenomenon. Now, if you don't see how this relates to some of the things about about this, we need to think about what it might mean for us. So there's a lot of friction here in the deBoer Turkheimer debate. We're thinking about how we can synthesize this for what we are looking at. One thing we can think about is the fact that no matter what you view these heritability things as being related to, it proves that meritocracy is not just about individual merit, in the sense that social conditions do change and define individual merit profoundly, and that there are factors, both biological and, more importantly for our discussion here, sociological, that contribute to a problem. If you think about the problems of the managerial state and the need for expertise, the use of genetics provides a biological foundation for this critique. If deBoer is right that academic aptitude is largely innate, whether biological or not, then the managerial class isn't actually composed of the most capable leaders. It is simply a cast of people who happen to win a genetic lottery for a specific type of symbol processing. And since they have very little external competition, we can expect them to degenerate somewhat quickly. And again, outstripping any breeding that you might add into this before people somehow miss my point. So even if things have a biological basis, there's a large indication that sociological factors can contribute to massive declines. Thus, we can think about merit being used as a justification for class rule and for access to certain kinds of skills. It still may be true that most people do not have these kinds of skills, but we see generational glass flooring for certain elites, regardless of their genetic inheritance, meaning that there are people who no longer are competent in these highly competent fields. Are they so specialized that they no longer can think in a broad manner, even if they are competent, both by educational means, meritocratically, or genetically? If the claim of authority is based on expertise, then merit is, as a biological accident, means that it isn't really anything that anyone worked for. We might need them for certain things, but there's no reason to assume that just because someone is intelligent at symbol parsing that they should be a leader. There's also no reason to assume necessarily they shouldn't be. You just have to think about this in a broader spectrum than many people in these debates do. Furthermore, education is largely a de-risking mechanism for capital and a cost externalizing mechanism for capital. All right. deBoer argues that schools are now just high stakes HR departments effectively. And I think in this, he's really not wrong. Companies training workers themselves, which is a form of biological, of environmental intervention, costs them money, and they'd rather force the state and the individual to pay for a degree that somehow signals innate ability, even if it should be their duty to train people because it's their gains primarily from the training of workers. So this is both de-risking, removing the risk of them doing the sorting of employees themselves for large capital firms or even small capital firms, and it's a form of outsourcing costs to externalities, thus creating training pools at the cost of the individual or society and not at the cost of the people who need the specific skills. Thus, it is a sorting mechanism, going back to that primary contradiction in American modern education, that we promise to be both equitable and a primary sorting mechanism for the market. journalists in the middle class in particular don't want to give up on meritocracy for a variety of reasons. I mean, journalists tend to be from relatively elite classes because journalism is a low-paying profession. Teaching is becoming that way, by the way. There are graduate assistants to such a profession, etc. People will note that a lot of people in these professions are richer than the general public. That's particularly true for news, but news is where we can see this the most explicitly. Used to work in news. There were more working class journalists in the mid 20th century than now. As pay and resources and profitability went down in the field, you need more and more unpaid internships, which require people to have resources and forego pay for long periods of time. Most poor people cannot do that. Meaning that this becomes a claim of merit and even a claim of noblesse oblige merit, since the children of elite now do it. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why they might want to do this for social control reasons, but it's just something to think about. And as I've said before, pretty much outside of the military, the only other generalists in our society are journalists, and they kind of suck. Why do I say they're journalists? Because we expect journalists to be able to write on a variety of topics knowledgeably. When I used to work for a newspaper in college, which I did very briefly, I was expected to be able to write about sports, including ones I didn't care about, and science, and local politics, even though I was also expected to be able to eventually specialize in one of them. All right. deBoer is right that we should just be focusing on a more functional society, not a society where education is somehow a panacea for everything that we need to fix, whether it's genetic or not. And as I've said today, there's reasons to think that it is both genetic and not. That's irrelevant to our larger cause here. And the idea that somehow these elites have a cluster of things that make them consistently elite seems to not deal with the fact that many of these elites actually decline faster than genetic variants would allow for. We've seen elites decline even without being overthrown in many societies very quickly. See Luke Kemp's collapse, Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies, etc., for how this happens. So the fade out effect is one of the most contested areas in educational sociology because it forces us to choose between two interpretations, and it's not one that we can easily deal with. And I want to talk about Freddie deBoer and the fade out effect here. Is the battery of the student dying, which is deBoer's view, or is the changing situation, is the charging station being removed, which is the structuralist view, or, as I tend to believe, are somehow both at play? Freddie probably believes both, but he doesn't argue both clearly in the Cult of Smart. So let's talk about the fade out effect. Here are the problems with using the fade out effect as evidence for innate cognitive limits. Toxic environment reentry problem. deBoer interprets the drop of test scores as a regression to the mean, implying a biological snapback, or at least a sociological snapback, without talking about what contributes to either thing. Now, I think Freddie's still being somewhat fair here. His book is not to get into the scope of the precise arguments of genetics, but I want to talk about what it could also be. One is that there are regressions to the environment that you are in. If you give a child high quality intervention from pages 3 to 5 and then return them back to an underfunded, chaotic teach to task public school for the next few years, the initial gain should be expected to evaporate since the inputs are changing. Students at track who stay high in high quality pipelines show a much more durable gains than ones that are put back into the same system that they were removed from. If the fade out effect is true, then it is as often a measure of the inconsistency of support as it is to the limits of the child. The sleeper effect, which is non-cognitive gain. deBoer focused heavily on IQ and standardized test scores because they are clean psychometric data. Clean here, however, is a little bit problematic. Now, they are cleaner than grades and other things that we judge people by. God forbid extracurriculars and stuff that you really have to have social advantage to even begin to do. But What is interesting is some of the effects actually are more complicated than you think. So, for example, the most famous intervention study, which is the Perry Preschool Project, shows a fascinating paradox. IQ gains in the students actually faded over the course of their lifetimes, but their life outcomes did not change accordingly. I'm going to repeat that again. In the Perry Preschool Project, IQ gains did fade, but life outcomes did not. So decades later, the intervention group in the Perry Preschool Project had significantly higher employment rates, higher earnings, and lower incarceration rates than the control group, despite having a nearly identical adult IQ. So, IQ maybe not as correlative to success when you control for other factors that are manifested in high quality childhood interventions. But high quality childhood interventions won't just be about schooling. When you learn about the Harlem School Project or the Perry Preschool Project, you actually see there are massive interventions into the home that have to go along with it for it to work. And nobody likes that. All right. The other thing is IQ is separate from executive function and social emotional regulation, both of which are actually more strongly correlated to life success than even IQ is. If an intervention makes a child more conscious or resilient, then it has worked, even if the IQ doesn't show a permanent jump, because you will see significant increases in even our capitalist pseudo-meritocratic outcomes when you look at that. All right. Now, there's a few more problems to deal with when you deal with the fade-out effect. Some statisticians argue that the fade-out is an illusion created by how we measure intelligence at different ages. And this is actually related to the nature of the IQ ratio itself. Early childhood tests measure developmental milestones such as motor skills and basic languages. But when we get to adolescent and adult testing, we are measuring abstract reasoning by itself. This means that the gains measured at age 4 aren't even the same kinds of processes as the intelligence measured at 15 or 16. We may be comparing apples to oranges and then claiming the apple failed to turn into a bigger apple when it was actually a kumquat we were measuring the entire time. They're all fruit, not remotely the same thing. This is actually one of the more major critiques I have against the cult of smart. I think Freddie is by and large correct, but this does need to be taken into account. When we talk about what a viable and functional society would be, we also have to deal with the fact that IQ is only a partial measurement of something that it makes someone successful in our society. And if we're talking about changing society, it's going to be even more variant. People who try to naturalize this to create an internal caste system that does not change are obviously doing something that is not justified by the science, no matter what they claim. Now, this does not mean that human beings are going to be equal as in the same. And I want to be very clear about that. Equality is a fuzzy concept. I talk about power egalitarianism because it's something that I think we can mean. Do you have equal access to change the society in which you live in? And by the way, if we all have equal access in a society in which we live in, and there's 320 million people in that country, and 8 billion in the world society, then even that equal contribution would be relatively small. Do you have the power to recall leaders and discipline them when they do not do what they're supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And this does get more diffuse the larger the society is. I do admit this is a major problem for socialists, but it's also something we should really be thinking about when I talk about power egalitarianism. I do not believe we will ever make everybody equally smart, equally strong, equally tall. Marx didn't either, by the way. Go read Critique of the Goethe Program. He talks about this notion of equality as only ever being able to be abstract, as in before the law or before some kind of abstract set of rights. in reality, it's not the case. We can't expect the same amount of work from a person without an arm if our work is digging. Right? And it's not ableist to say that. It is more ableist to pretend that they could. The Vor views education as a competitive ranking system. Generalists view it as a functional threshold system. I think it's both. Even if Foucault IQ fades back to the average, an intervention may have pushed them above a literacy threshold or a numeracy threshold to function in a modern economy. So we go back to that older functional definition of universal basic skills, which I do support. The success shouldn't be defined as staying ahead of rich kids, which it may not be possible to do, even, if they could. If an intervention prevents a child from falling back into functional illiteracy, then it is a massive societal victory, regardless of where they're at on some barrel curve. I think this is important. But it does mean that we should be making school for a universal basic set of standards, not to make everyone college ready for some abstract job that most of them won't have the capacity for. Particularly if it's at their own expense. That's absurd. One of the things with the obsession with fade outs is because the state wants a one and done fix for poverty, not to actually fix poverty, but to get people to shut the fuck up about it. The state loves early childhood intervention because it's cheaper than fixing housing and healthcare or focusing on labor power. When a cheap fix, pre-K, doesn't solve an expensive problem, generational poverty, people can blame deBoer, radicals can blame the state, it really doesn't matter. People blaming deBoer because deBoer blames biology partially. The thing is, Freddie says we should just be focusing on making a society that has room for all these kinds of people, and I actually think that too. Not just room, but the dignity of labor suited to their experience and abilities. We should not be tossing so many people aside. Which you're always going to do if your entire structure is to create basically management. So we might say that there's some other problems here. So, for example, talking about grit or resilience is a classic move that people may do. Like grit and resilience is an individual trait, which you may actually need to survive. And I would encourage you to do it, but it is still something that can be used to individualize a systemic failure. If a student from a disinvested neighborhood fails, and the grit theory blames their lack of character rather than their lack of resources. We need to teach them grit because it's a useful skill to have, but we also need to deal with the larger resource problem, which is something I know Freddie would agree with me on. But by making this thing about individual grit, you can depoliticize all kinds of issues related to power inequality. Notice I'm limiting our types of inequality here. Power and wealth inequality is what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about whether or not we can make people all the same. We can't. I'm also not concerned about merit because, frankly, that is such a fluctuating concept, even more than intelligence, that I'm not sure that it's super useful, except as an ideological ploy. But if we're just focusing on grit and education, we might be teaching poor children how to endure more effectively and even strive in that environment, but we're not fixing the larger environmental problem caused by capitalism. There's also the compliance versus culpability paradox. Non-cognitive matrix play a massive role in social success. Traits like conscientiousness are often indistinguishable from docility and compliance. Of course, people who are docile and compliant do better in systems that are set up for docile and compliant people. Schools may not be better at making children smarter, but they are better at making them workers by helping them with non cognitive capacities, such as grit, which is effectively a measure of how much boredom and repetitive labor a person can tolerate without protesting, and docility, which is obvious, but how much they'll take orders, which are key skills for a service and administrative economy. They're not actually all that great for industrial economy. That's one that actually uses people in the production process, and they're not actually all that good for a creative economy. But again, there's also some stuff on grit that's relatively interesting. Now, you might be wondering why I'm focusing on grit, because I just said it was good. It is correlative to success in our society, but I want you to think about the problems with that. Now, I actually think that we should be teaching workers and everyday people how to be more gritty, because I need a disciplined subject, a disciplined political subject. But I do not want people to think that that's going to make them successful in life in and of itself. Even in a meritocratic system, any bit of luck at all would play a major role in who gets ahead. In fact, mathematically, I've seen it worked out that even if it's only 10 to 20% of what causes you to get ahead in life, if you took 100 people and did the top 10%, it would still be 70 to 80% of them who got ahead by luck, even if luck was the only a contributing factor to 20% of their success. Now, I'm just saying that that is a mathematical exercise. We can't measure that in reality. There's no way to measure luck like that. There's no way to figure out what percentage luck plays. But it's just important to point out that in highly competitive environments, with people who are being sorted by differentiation on merit, luck would still be the determining factor of who's at the top for more people than not. So the paradox of grit is interesting. Students in high pressure charter schools often score lower on self reported grit than students in regular schools, even though they have better test scores and sometimes even better life outcomes, although that's variable depending on their zip code. Yeah, the zip code matters more than what school they go to, because grit is relative. In a high pressure environment, a student compares themselves to elite peers and feels lazy, where a student in a relaxed environment may need to be gritty, but they feel more gritty. So when you test that and do preference reporting on the attitudes that lead to grit, you will see people in lower environments showing as having more, even though they're not as successful. This means that the non-cognitive skills that contribute to merit are almost impossible to measure objectively without factoring in all the advantages and disadvantages of the cohort of which you are measuring them against. They are social constructs that reflect everything from how we define the terms to the culture of the school, rather than just the character of the student, because the character of student is itself social. Character is a social mask. It does not exist outside of a social context. This is vital when you're talking about this shit. I think that the middle class in particular doesn't want to give up in the meritocratic ideology, even if the elites sometimes will. Since IQ has become politically correct or seen as too fixed, as Freddie argues, the middle class has pivoted to character, just like the administrative state has pivoted to morality as opposed to competence to justify its administration. You don't believe me? Look at what people do. If you look at what either conservatives or liberals do right now, it is appeals to a set of social values and justice traits and social norms that are not even consistent over time to justify what they're doing, not even competence in producing outcomes anymore. Why? Because they're probably not competent at producing outcomes anymore. I know I sound like a declinist to a lot of people, because in some ways that I am, but I think this is from lack of social competition, which a relatively power equal society would create. Furthermore, both the managerial class and the bourgeoisie it serves love to believe that they deserve their status because they are born a certain way or have the grit to get a certain way, and because they are harder workers or more emotionally intelligent. It replaces biological distinctions with a moral hierarchy that is flattering, particularly to people in the middle class. We have a couple more videos on this that I'm going to go. I don't think I'm going to go more than 7 videos on this piece. We are kind of outside of the scope of the what people want from our schools have never been accomplished anywhere ever, although I still agree with that general thesis, and more into deBoer's arguments in The Cult of Smart and the limitations of those. But I still want people to be very clear. I am not rejecting that there are genetic factors that contribute to the cluster of things we call intelligence. I am not saying that schooling or making better schools is going to fix that, because there's no evidence that it will. I am saying that if we work on the society, we will know a lot more about what is generalizable and what isn't, what distinctions are natural and what aren't. Right now, we don't know. And heritability should not mean genetic determination of and by itself, since genes also are caused to express by environmental triggers. Don't use a 1980s argument in a time where we have 40 more years of genetic science since we mapped the human genome to talk about this. Now, on our next episode, I'll talk about relative versus absolute games, funding illusions that are involved in schools, and some other elements where I agree with Freddie and the Cult of Smart, and some places where I disagree with him. And then we'll pivot to one more of his articles about the quote-unquote crisis in education that he doesn't think exists. And again, I think there is a crisis in education. I don't think there's a crisis in schooling. And I don't just say that because I'm a teacher. I say that because I've watched the interventions now for 20 years involved in the profession and have studied it for longer than that. And looking at the longitudinal data since we've achieved universal schooling access in the 1970s, there is little to no growth of any significance. There's been some closing of gaps, but even those closing of gaps sometimes happen because the top end is falling, not because the bottom end is rising up. And there are other factors that make this very complicated, such as the Flynn effect, the reversing of the Flynn effect in the developed world, our inability to know what's causing either of those things, our lack of knowledge of what gene triggers exist and don't exist on certain complicated traits, and the fact that genetic variants have sociological consequences that can be mitigated for by social tasks that we aren't mitigating for because we don't know to do it. Protect your peace. I'll put some of my links in the show notes this time so you can do the research for yourself as well. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. My class on the controversies of Marxism, which will be going from June 22nd to July 3rd, which is a 2-week period. It's every other day during the week. Is filling up. If you want to find out, go to the Patreon and look for it. It's there. My book with Daniel Tutt, or Daniel talks about with me. I don't know. I don't want to hierarchize which one of us did more. I think Daniel actually probably wrote more of the letters in that book, but I know he did. We came up with the ideas together, though. We brainstormed a bit. We commented together. We gave each other feedback. It's a collaborative process. But our book together, The People Are Not One, will be coming out in June. I will be doing dates in the Baltimore, DC, and New York area between July 18th and July 28th. The specific dates are still being nailed down, but the dates that I'm going to be in that region are now nailed down. Take care. Thank you for your support. If you support me, leave a comment to help the video in the algorithm. Share, like, review the free podcast if you want to help us. on wherever you review it. Usually right now, Spotify is probably more helpful than Apple. And look on Patreon if you want more news. Take care.